Right now, thousands are mobilizing for a national day of action for voting rights. Democratic members of Congress joining demonstrators for a rally in Montgomery. And joining me now is New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, a member of the Foreign Relations and Judiciary Committees. Senator, welcome. Glad to have you here. I know it's a busy time there. We can hear someone speaking behind you. We've heard music. We've had a lot of impactful statements said today, but also festivities. But let's talk about the rally and what you hope will be accomplished by it today.
Yeah, well, I'm here in Alabama because my roots are here. I'm here because I know very consciously I'm the descendant of slaves in this country. I'm here because of Americans in times of trial, when the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson or Dred Scott or Korematsu took rights away from people. People didn't just accept that limitations on our democracy. They fought for bolder freedoms. And so that's why I'm here today. It's a rallying cry. This is a civic altar call of sorts to call people back together like we did a generation ago to better secure the rights that now seem to be so taken away by the Supreme Court.
And indeed, it is because that Supreme Court upheld the Virginia High Court's ruling from 2 weeks ago, essentially gutting the Voting Rights Act, effectively reducing black representation in Congress. So describe where that leaves voters and the makeup of Congress.
We declare and decree.
Well, it is echoes of what happened in the post-Reconstruction period, where people in places of power, in courts and legislators, passed all kinds of laws to try to stop African Americans from having representation, to try to stop African Americans from exercising their rights as citizens. And so now, after the Supreme Court case, we see legislatures like this one here drawing congressional maps with surgical-like precision to stop African Americans from having a voice in Congress, eviscerating African-American representation from many states. And so this is unacceptable, not for black America, but for our America, for the America that believes in fair maps and fair democracies and fair voting. And so we have to respond to this by organizing and mobilizing, and that's what this is about today.
Do you have a guesstimate, sir, on how many black representatives could be lost in the House?
Yeah, they're talking about numbers from 10 to 25. We're watching states now scramble to figure out if they can get it done before this midterm election or if they're going to have to wait until the 2028 elections. They're saying the quiet part out loud. We know what they're going to try to do. And all Americans, I don't care what your background is, Republicans, independents, and Democrats all agree that partisan gerrymandering is unfair when people in power can concentrate that power, so even if they're in the minority, they still have more seats and more representations. That is fundamentally anti-democratic, and it must be stopped. But it's not going to be stopped automatically or inevitably. It has to be stopped by organized people mobilizing and demanding and electing people that will stop it.
So is that what it is? It's organizing? That's the best approach for Democrats in the midterms to fight back? And can or will Democrats still win the House despite this GOP gerrymandering? We see the numbers, and they seem to be ticking because of Republican efforts in the favor of Republicans picking up a lot more seats.
Well, I hear you putting this in a lens of partisan politics. I'm here in Alabama not because of partisan politics, but because I want to save our democratic system. This isn't just about who's got advantage, the right or the left of our political spectrum. This is about, will we have fairness at our elections? Every American should be invested in ending this madness that's been unleashed by a Supreme Court. Every American, whether you're a Republican in California or a Democrat in Texas, should say this serves nobody to have people doing this. And it especially is really desecrating our martyrs, people who died in Mississippi like Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, 4 black girls that died here in Alabama and Birmingham in a bombing. We know that there are people in our past generations to stand up to stop just this. And so we can't allow it. I'm sorry, I'm not here as a Democrat. I'm here as an American.
Meantime, you're facing a primary on Tuesday. In the wake of Senator Bill Cassidy's loss in the primaries yesterday in Louisiana, the president has been up posting on Truth Social throughout the night and into the morning about you. Just a few minutes ago, he posted this. I want to show our viewers right now. Bad Congressman Tom Massey voted against tax cuts, the border wall, our military enforcement. Actually, he voted against almost everything that is good. The worst congressman in history. Kentucky, vote the bum out on Tuesday. We can't live with this troublemaker for another 2 years. He's a true negative force. Your response?
Well, I think that's going to help my fundraising at thomasmassey.com. Every time he tweets about me, it's good for, some money coming in because people don't like that. And, how did this race become the most expensive race in the history of Congress for a primary? It's because 3 billionaires from outside of Kentucky have funneled millions of dollars in here. They're trying to buy a seat. And so it's not just the president's tweets. I could sustain those without a problem. It's because Miriam Adelson and Paul Singer have dumped money in here. In fact, Miriam Adelson has given so much money to my opponent that instead of paying for the ballroom, they're going to need taxpayer money for the ballroom now.
Well, you've actually said this week that your vote is a referendum on whether Israel gets to buy seats in Congress. What did you mean by that?
Well, the RJC, AIPAC, and Miriam Adelson and Paul Singer, they're all part of the Israeli lobby, and that's where all the money comes from. And it will be a referendum on foreign policy, whether Israel gets to dictate that by, bullying members of Congress. And I'm the one they haven't been able to bully, so they're putting all the brunt and the force on me. But you can tell that I'm ahead in the polls and they're desperate. That's why they're sending the Secretary of War to my district tomorrow. That's why the president's losing sleep and tweeting about this. That's why AIPAC has dumped another $3 million into my race this weekend. It's because they're panicked and they really haven't been able to gain a lead in this race.
You say the president is desperate, but he's got a pretty good record of defeating people he wants to target in Republican primaries. We saw Bill Cassidy yesterday. We saw what happened in Indiana. How are you going to be able to overcome the president's opposition?
Well, I have the endorsement of the Right to Life organizations, the gun organizations. I had 4 members of Congress come here yesterday and campaign with me. So my situation is a little bit different. Plus, I've had millions of dollars come in from the grassroots, tens of thousands of donors to my website, thomasmassey.com. And it's still coming in, and that's how we're going to beat them.
With transactional politics, ethical transactionality has its space in this American democracy. Republicans are naked with it and often unethical with it. Democrats believe in slow progress, and we believe in proposing a commission which will consider studying how to solve a potential problem down the road. It's got to be time out for that because people are losing rights in real time when you don't take real action.
David, that is true, and people are going to be upset, and they're going to vote. But a lot of the damage, I guess a lot of people would say, is done, right? A lot of this is baked in. And so when you talk to Republicans, are they at all worried about this backlash, or are they thinking of it in like strict political terms, as they have done successfully on this issue for such a long time?
I think they're looking at it strictly politically for the most part, in that politicians never, I say this every week, as long as it's not Tuesday yet, they don't look past this Tuesday. Right. So if you're a Republican looking at losing the majority and the Supreme Court makes a decision about how you can draw districts that allows them to increase the size of their majority by a mid-decade redraw, they're going to do it, and they're going to worry about the consequences later. I think, as a matter of strategy, one of the reasons why all of the generic balloting has Democrats in front and growing their advantage on the generic ballot is because voters are concerned about affordability and inflation and the war, and Democrats can maximize this by focusing on that. And they need to be careful not to make promises about legislation that they cannot deliver. And with a 60-vote filibuster, you cannot deliver anything without enough bipartisan support. And if they're looking ahead to 2028, again, something politicians don't tend to do until they're there, you don't want to make promises you are not keeping, because your voters are then going to look at the next election and say, you said you were going to do this, you couldn't deliver it, why am I showing up this time? And so there's just a lot to factor in. But Republicans, it's all pure politics, but that's what you would expect from incumbents who want to keep their jobs.
Yeah. Because I've talked to a lot of Democrats, and that's where many of them are too, especially some of the strategists, where it's like, we can't make promises we can't keep. Like, we're going to get the gavel. We should say the things that we actually can get done in the House. Maybe the Senate will do its own thing, but like, say what you're going to do in the House and go from there. Otherwise, there might be a backlash on Democrats, because voters are willing to try new things, right? And that's the thing I think that 2024 should have taught everybody, is that there are a lot of black men and brown men who would have never voted for Donald Trump, but things felt so dire to them at that time. They said, you know what? Okay, well, this guy wasn't working. Let's try someone else. This woman wasn't working. Let's try something else. And that is new, I think, in politics.
I think you have to remember one of the reasons Donald Trump was able to swipe the Republican nomination from that collection of very capable candidates in 2016 because the Republicans, from the voters' point of view, Republican voters had been making lots of promises about what they would do with their congressional majorities, and they weren't able to deliver, not on repealing the Affordable Care Act and a number of other things. And so people said, you know, I've been voting for all the normal candidates, the candidates you told me I was supposed to vote for. You guys haven't delivered. I'll take a flyer on this guy. Right. And Democrats could end up caught up in that very same thing, just in a different way if they repeat that pattern. Yeah.
The problem is that flyer has real ramifications for real people's lives. So it's not just experimentation when you're talking about eliminating people's civil rights and liberties. And so that's why the political experimentation thing means a little bit more when you're in one of those marginalized groups.
David Drucker, former Missouri State Representative Don Calloway, with a message for his frat brother. See if he sees it.
What really caught my attention in this entire discussion is that we are starting to see something happen that almost nobody expected a few years ago. People from completely opposite sides of the political spectrum are beginning to push back against Donald Trump for very different reasons. On one side, you have massive voting rights demonstrations and civil rights activists warning that recent court decisions and redistricting efforts are undermining democratic representation. On the other side, you have deeply conservative Republicans like Thomas Massie openly refusing to fall in line behind Trump, even while facing enormous political pressure from inside their own party. Those are two very different worlds politically, but both are reacting to the same broader issue: the growing perception that power is becoming more centralized, more aggressive, and less accountable. And honestly, I think that matters a lot more than people realize. The transcript talked extensively about concerns over partisan gerrymandering and the weakening of voting protections after recent Supreme Court decisions. What struck me is that even though these debates often get framed as purely partisan fights between Democrats and Republicans, underneath it is a much deeper argument about whether Americans still trust the fairness of the system itself. Once people begin believing that elections are being engineered before votes are even cast, public trust starts collapsing very quickly. And trust is one of those things that is incredibly difficult to rebuild once it is damaged. I also think Senator Booker made an important point when he framed the issue historically instead of just politically. America has gone through periods before where courts and lawmakers restricted rights or manipulated systems in ways that later generations looked back on with embarrassment. That is part of why debates around voting access become so emotionally charged. For many Americans, these fights are not abstract legal arguments. They are tied to the country's long history involving civil rights, representation, and political equality. At the same time, what fascinated me even more was the Republican side of this conversation involving Thomas Massie. Here you have a very conservative congressman openly resisting Trump despite knowing the political risks involved. And regardless of whether people agree with Massie's policies, I think many Americans are noticing that it takes a certain amount of political courage to stand against someone who still exercises enormous influence over the Republican base. That is important because for years, critics argued that almost nobody inside the Republican Party was willing to publicly challenge Trump anymore. But now you are starting to see fractures appear. Not necessarily because these Republicans suddenly became liberals or anti-conservative, but because some of them are becoming uncomfortable with the level of loyalty and submission expected inside Trump's political movement. The transcript also touched on the role of massive donor money flooding into primaries and influencing races. And honestly, I think Americans across the political spectrum are becoming increasingly frustrated with the feeling that billionaire money and outside influence dominate modern politics. Whether it comes from corporations, lobbying groups, wealthy donors, or political action committees, many voters feel like ordinary citizens are losing influence while powerful financial interests gain more control over who gets elected and what policies are prioritized. Another thing that stood out to me was the discussion about broken political promises. One of the commentators pointed out that voters eventually become frustrated when politicians repeatedly promise sweeping change but fail to deliver meaningful results once they gain power. I actually think that frustration helps explain a huge amount of modern political instability in both parties. Many Americans are no longer voting out of loyalty or optimism. Increasingly, they are voting out of frustration, exhaustion, or desperation for something different. And that creates a very unpredictable political environment. Because once voters stop trusting institutions, stop trusting parties, and stop trusting political promises, they become much more willing to take risks on outsider candidates, anti-establishment movements, or confrontational political figures. We already saw that dynamic help fuel Trump's rise in 2016, but now, ironically, some of that same anti-establishment energy is starting to turn back against Trump himself from multiple directions. To me, that is the bigger story here. It is not simply Democrats versus Republicans anymore. It is that growing numbers of Americans, even people who disagree with each other on almost everything else, are becoming uncomfortable with how concentrated political power, influence, and loyalty have become in modern American politics. And once that discomfort starts spreading broadly across both sides of the spectrum, it can become very difficult for any political movement to fully control the narrative anymore.